Some cases start with a body, some start with a confession, but the case of Chase Lackey started with something far more ordinary. A young man living his life, doing what people his age do, until one day he didn't. And what came after that silence would pull investigators into one of the most layered and disturbing cases they had seen in a long time. Because with Chase Lackey, nothing was exactly what it appeared to be, and the closer you look, the darker it gets. Chase Lackey was young, and like most people his age, he was trying to figure things out. Life, relationships, his place in the world. Nothing about his day-to-day existence suggested he was in danger. Nothing obvious anyway. To the people around him, he was just Chase, a familiar face, a recognizable name, someone you didn't worry about. Which is exactly why what happened next hit so hard. Because the people who knew him never saw it coming, and maybe that was it began the way these things often do, with absence. Chase stopped responding, stopped showing up, stopped being reachable in the ways he normally was. At first, the people around him assumed the usual: phone issues, busy schedule, just needed some time. People tell themselves these things because the alternative is too heavy to hold. But as time stretched on and the silence grew louder, the alternative became impossible to ignore. Something had happened to Chase Lackey. The only question was, when people started asking questions, the answers they got were thin, vague, almost rehearsed. No one seems to know exactly where Chase had gone. No one could pinpoint the last time they saw him with any real certainty, and the timeline of his final days was murky in a way that felt deliberate, not confused, deliberate, like someone had already decided what version of the story the world was going to hear and had started telling it before everyone even knew to ask. Investigators started pulling threads: last known location, last confirmed contact, last person to see Chase alive, and almost immediately they hit resistance. Not the obvious kind, not someone refusing to cooperate, but the subtle kind. Stories that almost matched but not quite. Details that shifted just slightly between conversations. A timeline that, when laid flat on a table, had holes in it, and in an investigation, holes are never accidental. Here is what made this case particularly chilling. Chase Lackey wasn't taken by a stranger. He wasn't the victim of some random act of violence from someone who did not know him. The answers investigators were looking for were coming from inside his own circle. People who knew his name, who knew his habits, who knew exactly how to make his absence look like a choice, and who had clearly thought about this carefully before anyone started asking for. Think about what that means for a moment. Someone close to Chase knew what happened and chose silence, chose a constructed story, chose to let the people who loved him wonder, chose to let the questions pile up with no answers. That level of calculated behavior is not impulsive. It doesn't happen in the heat of a moment. It happens when someone had already thought through what comes next, which tells investigators something critical. This wasn't chaos, this was control. As investigators began applying pressure, the carefully built story started showing its cracks, because that's the thing about deception. It works best in the short term. In the long term, under repeated questioning, under the weight of evidence being gathered quietly in the background, it starts to fracture. A detail here, a contradiction there, a moment where someone says something that doesn't match what they said before. And in Chase's case, those fractures came slowly at first, then all at once. What began to emerge from those cracks was a picture that investigators had suspected but needed to prove. Chase Lackey didn't walk away. Chase Lackey wasn't living somewhere new under a different name. Chase Lackey was the victim, and the people who should have been the most devastated by that truth were the ones who already knew it. That realization shifts everything in a case like this, because now it's not about finding someone, it's about proving what happened and holding the right people. Evidence began stacking: digital records, witness accounts, physical evidence that contradicted the story being told. Piece by piece, the constructed narrative fell apart, and what remained underneath it was raw and undeniable. Chase had been failed, not just in the moments that ended his life, but in the days and hours before that, when someone who should have protected him chose something else instead. Cases like Chase Lackey's leave a mark not just on the people who loved him, but on everyone who follows it, because it confronts something deeply uncomfortable: the idea that danger doesn't always come from the outside, that sometimes the threat is already inside the house, already sitting at the table, already calling you by your name. And that is a reality that no amount of caution fully prepares you for, because it requires a level of trust that most of us never think to question. Chase Lackey deserved better. He deserved answers while he was still alive to receive them. He deserved protection from the people who were supposed to give it. And he deserved a world that paid attention before it was too late. But since we can't give him that, the least we can do is remember his name, understand his story, and let it sharpen the way we see the world around us. Because in true crime, the cases that stayed with us longest are not the ones with the most dramatic headlines. They are the ones that remind us how quietly and how suddenly everything can change. Chase Lackey's story is one of those cases, and it should never